The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of silence that settles in before anyone realizes something meaningful is about to happen. No one expected a 9-year-old boy to enter holding his mother's shaking hand. Ethan Miller stayed pressed against her side, his small fingers wrapped tightly around her sleeve, as if letting go might cause everything to collapse. His mother, Laura, looked worn down to her core. Dark circles framed her eyes, her face pale with exhaustion, her posture heavy with the invisible weight of a life lived in constant struggle. Judge Frank Caprio noticed them immediately. His attention went first to the child. His expression softened, though a quiet seriousness remained in his eyes. Experience told him this was not an ordinary case. Laura had been summoned for several unpaid parking tickets, but the presence of a child said there was more beneath the surface. Before Laura could speak, Ethan stepped forward. He wasn't tall enough to reach the microphone, but he stretched upward anyway, determined to be heard. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, surprised by the bravery of a child who should have been sitting in a classroom, not standing in a courtroom. No one expected what followed. Ethan's voice trembled as he stood between the judge and his mother. He took a breath, steadying himself, and spoke, not like a frightened child, but like someone trying to protect the most important person in his world. "My mom didn't mean to break the rules," he said softly. "She was trying to get to work. I was sick that day. She didn't want to leave me alone." A quiet gasp rippled through the room. Laura lifted her hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. Judge Caprio paused, studying the boy, the honesty in his words, the courage in his posture, the way he stood like a shield in front of his mother. Something had changed. Everyone in the room felt it. The courtroom waited. That morning in Providence, the silence felt heavier than usual as Judge Caprio took his seat. There was a stillness in the air, as though the room itself sensed a moment was coming. On one side stood Laura Miller, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked drained, the kind of tired that came not from one hard night, but from years of hardship. Beside her stood Ethan, thin and quiet, gripping the edge of her coat as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. His eyes moved carefully across the room, not fearful, but alert. It was the look of a child who had learned too early how fragile life could be. The clerk read the charges aloud, multiple parking violations and a missed court appearance. Laura rose slowly. Ethan did not move. He stayed close, refusing to take even half a step away. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses and watched them carefully. Thousands of cases had passed before him, but something about this pair stood out. Before a word was spoken, Laura apologized immediately. Her voice was strained as she explained she had missed the court date while juggling a second job and caring for Ethan. Her income barely covered rent and food. Bills piled up faster than she could manage. The car was her lifeline to work, and when the tickets came, she pushed them aside, telling herself she would deal with them later. Later never arrived, because survival always came first. The judge listened without interruption. He could see she wasn't avoiding responsibility. She was overwhelmed. Before he could respond, Ethan stepped forward again. It wasn't dramatic, just a small movement, but it caught everyone's attention. Laura gently tried to pull him back. Ethan shook his head. Judge Caprio leaned in and asked Ethan why he had come to court. Ethan answered simply. He didn't want his mom to come alone. He didn't want her to be scared. He had seen her sitting at the kitchen table every night, counting bills, deciding which ones could be paid and which had to wait. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough to know she needed help. The room grew still. Even the prosecutor looked up. Laura wiped her eyes and apologized, insisting her son shouldn't have to explain their struggles. But Ethan kept his eyes on the judge, carrying a burden no child should have to carry. Judge Caprio watched closely. Years on the bench had taught him the truth often lived in moments like this. A mother doing everything she could to protect her child. A child trying to protect his mother in return. Something deeper was unfolding. As Ethan stepped back beside Laura, the tension shifted. Laura tried to steady herself, but her hands still trembled. She avoided eye contact, hoping the judge wouldn't notice how close she was to breaking. But Judge Caprio already understood. The prosecutor cleared his throat and read the full list of violations: multiple tickets, expired registration, failure to appear. The penalties had grown into an amount impossible for a struggling family. Ethan gently held his mother's sleeve, as though afraid she might collapse without him. Laura apologized again, explaining she had missed deadlines because of double shifts at the diner. She had gone without car insurance 1 month to keep a roof over their heads. Every word came out quietly, each sentence heavier than the last, and the courtroom waited to see what justice, guided by humanity, would look like next. Here is a full, complete rewrite in English, maintaining the same length, same emotional weight, and same story progression. Nothing is shortened, nothing skipped, nothing summarized, only the wording is changed. Her words came out controlled and careful, almost practiced, as though she had spent countless nights rehearsing how to explain herself in the most polite and respectful way possible. Judge Caprio listened closely, yet he sensed there was more beneath the surface. Her voice carried deep exhaustion, but beneath it was something sharper and more unsettling: fear. He asked her why the car remained so essential if keeping up with fines, paperwork, and deadlines had become so overwhelming. Laura hesitated. Ethan glanced up at her, almost as if he expected her to stay quiet, but she pushed herself to answer honestly. She needed the car to get to work. The prosecutor then added that one of the violations involved overnight parking near a hospital. That detail caught the judge's attention more than the others. His tone softened as he asked why she had been there so late at night. Laura swallowed, struggling to form the words, but before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward once again. This time, his small voice shook, but it did not fail. He explained that they had been at the hospital because his grandmother had been admitted multiple times over the past few months. She struggled to breathe at night, and whenever her condition worsened, they rushed her there. The courtroom fell completely still. Judge Caprio nodded slowly and asked how many times they had gone. Ethan answered without hesitation. He had kept track because he was often awake at night, listening for his grandmother's coughing. He remembered 6 times. Laura gently corrected him. It had been more. She admitted she stopped telling him the exact number because she didn't want him worrying about missing school. The judge then asked why she hadn't reached out for help or explained her situation sooner. Laura answered quietly that she had been ashamed. She believed no one would take her seriously without documents or proof, and she didn't want to sound like she was making excuses. She had planned to fix everything once her next paycheck arrived. But by then, the fines had doubled. The prosecutor shifted in place, suddenly uneasy. What had looked like a straightforward list of violations now carried a human weight that could not be ignored. He acknowledged that city regulations still required enforcement, but admitted that circumstances clearly played a significant role in this case. Judge Caprio looked back at Ethan and noticed the boy pressing his lips together, struggling to stay composed. He asked him what he thought about everything that was happening. Ethan paused before answering. He said he wished he were older so he could help his mom more. He said he never wanted to see her cry again. He said that if paying the fine would stop her from being afraid, he would try to earn the money himself. The room tightened emotionally. Ethan's voice was quiet, but every person present heard him clearly. The honesty in his words carried more weight than any legal argument. The prosecutor looked down at his paperwork, pretending to review details he already knew, perhaps to give the moment the respect it deserved. Judge Caprio folded his hands, leaned forward, and took a slow breath. This was no longer just a case file. It was the story of a family trying to survive under pressures far beyond their control. The weight of the moment was undeniable, and the judge understood that what he did next would shape not only the outcome of the case, but a defining moment in the life of a young boy standing bravely before him. When Judge Caprio finally spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, and full of purpose. He asked Ethan one final question, one that would quietly shift everything. Though neither mother nor son yet understood what was about to happen, the judge leaned back in his chair, studying the boy who had placed himself between his mother and the full force of the law. Ethan stood there shaking slightly, yet resolute, as if he had finally found the courage to share something he had carried far too long. The courtroom remained silent, not from fear, but because everyone sensed that something meaningful was unfolding. Even the prosecutor lowered his gaze, recognizing that this moment had moved far beyond routine procedure. Laura tried to pull her son back, whispering for him to sit down, but Ethan gently shook his head. He wasn't being defiant. He was certain. Judge Caprio noticed and softened his tone further. He asked Ethan what he meant by wanting to take responsibility. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to speak, but the words wavered. It wasn't fear of punishment holding him back, it was the difficulty of explaining a truth he had never spoken aloud. The judge asked again, calmly encouraging him to share whatever was weighing on him. Ethan finally described their life at home. He explained how his mother worked nights and cleaned in the mornings, how she struggled just to keep the lights on. He said the day of the violation had been one of the hardest they had faced in months. He told the court his mother wasn't careless, she was exhausted from carrying everything alone. He described how she had nearly fallen asleep at the wheel earlier that week, yet still went to work because missing a shift meant missing meals. The room grew uncomfortable as Ethan explained how he often skipped breakfast so his mother could eat before leaving for work. His words came slowly, but they were clear. Even Laura, who had held herself together until then, began to break. She tried again to stop him, but Judge Caprio gently shook his head, signaling that the boy should continue. He believed that truth, once spoken, could heal more than silence ever could. Ethan explained that on the day of the violation, they had been rushing because his mother had just learned her paycheck had been delayed again. She parked illegally, not because she ignored the rules, but because stress and fear had overwhelmed her. He began to describe how frightened he had been that day. Her explanation came out steady and controlled, almost practiced, as though she had spent countless nights rehearsing how to speak respectfully without revealing too much. Judge Caprio listened closely, but something beneath her words stood out to him. Yes, there was exhaustion in her voice, but there was also fear, sharp and tightly held. He asked her why the car mattered so much if managing fines and paperwork had become impossible. Laura hesitated. Ethan glanced up at her, almost urging her to stay quiet, but she finally answered in a low voice. She needed the car to work. The prosecutor added another detail, one of the citations was for overnight parking near a hospital. That single fact caught the judge's attention more than the rest. His tone softened as he asked why she had been there so late. Laura swallowed, searching for words, but before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward again. His voice trembled this time, yet it didn't break. He explained they were at the hospital because his grandmother had been admitted multiple times over the past few months. She struggled to breathe at night, and whenever her condition worsened, they rushed her there. The courtroom went silent. Judge Caprio nodded slowly and asked how often they had gone. Ethan answered without hesitation. He remembered because he stayed awake most nights listening for his grandmother's coughing. He counted 6 times. Laura gently corrected him. It had been more than that. She admitted she stopped telling him the exact number because she didn't want him worrying about missing school. The judge asked why she hadn't asked for help sooner or explained her situation earlier. Laura admitted she felt ashamed. She believed no one would believe her without proof and feared it would sound like excuses. She planned to fix everything with her next paycheck. But before she could, the fines doubled. The prosecutors shifted in their seats. What had once been a straightforward list of violations now carried weight. The law on paper was simple. The reality behind it was not. The prosecutor acknowledged that while regulations still applied, the circumstances clearly mattered. Judge Caprio looked at Ethan again and noticed how tightly the boy pressed his lips together, fighting to stay composed. He asked Ethan what he thought about everything happening. The boy paused, then said he wished he were older so he could help his mother more. He said he never wanted to see her cry again. And if paying the fines would stop her fear, he would try to earn the money himself. The room tightened emotionally. Ethan's words were quiet, but they carried more power than any legal argument. The prosecutor looked down at his paperwork, pretending to reread it, perhaps to give the moment the respect it deserved. Judge Caprio folded his hands and leaned forward, taking a slow breath. This was no longer about tickets. It was the story of a family barely holding on. Then the judge asked Ethan one final question, one that neither mother nor son expected, and one that would change everything. Judge Caprio leaned back, studying the child who had placed himself between his mother and the full weight of the law. Ethan stood trembling but resolute, as if he had finally decided to reveal something he'd carried alone for too long. The courtroom remained silent, not out of fear, but awareness. Even the prosecutor lowered his gaze. Laura tried to guide her son back, whispering for him to sit down, but Ethan gently shook his head. He wasn't being defiant. He was certain. The judge softened his voice and asked what Ethan meant by wanting to take responsibility. The boy tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. It wasn't fear of punishment, it was the difficulty of explaining a truth he'd never said aloud. Judge Caprio calmly encouraged him to continue. Ethan explained how his mother worked nights and cleaned during the mornings. How she barely kept the lights on. How the day of the violation had been one of the hardest days they'd faced. He said she wasn't careless, she was exhausted from trying to support them alone. He told the courtroom she had once fallen asleep at the wheel but still went to work because missing a shift meant missing meals. The room shifted uncomfortably as Ethan admitted he often skipped breakfast so his mother could eat before leaving for work. His words came slowly but clearly. Laura finally broke, tears streaming as she tried once more to stop him. Judge Caprio gently shook his head, allowing the truth to continue. Ethan described how his mother cried in the car afterward, how afraid he'd been watching her break down. He said he didn't want her to get into more trouble because she was already carrying too much. Judge Caprio listened without interruption, compassion etched into his face. He looked at Laura, frozen between pride and shame, then addressed the courtroom. He spoke not about fines, but about humanity. About how courts exist not only to enforce rules, but to understand lives. Sometimes, he said, life becomes heavier than the law ever anticipated. The boy's honesty changed everything. What began as routine had become something rare, truth spoken without filters, fear, or excuses. Judge Caprio leaned forward and asked Ethan why he chose to speak now. The boy answered simply. Watching his mother tremble hurt more than any punishment ever could. He wanted to help her the only way he knew, by telling the truth. The turning point arrived. Judge Caprio sat quietly, then spoke with warmth. He praised Ethan's courage, telling him that few adults had shown such bravery. He turned to Laura and told her her strength was evident in the son she had raised. Life had been unkind, but the court saw her effort. Then he delivered his decision. All fines were dismissed. Late fees erased. The case closed. Laura collapsed into tears, wrapping her arm around Ethan as years of pressure finally lifted. Judge Caprio reminded her she should never feel ashamed for asking for help. He encouraged her to seek community support and reminded her she wasn't alone. Before closing the case, he looked at Ethan once more and told him that the smallest voices often carry the greatest truths. As they left the courtroom hand in hand, something stayed behind, not just a closed file, but a reminder. Justice, when guided by compassion, doesn't just resolve cases. It restores hope.